Ma'am, show me some ID right now.
Officer, this is my home. Why are you detaining me?
Step away from the door. Turn around.
4517, start me another unit. Possible obstruction.
This is a civil matter, sir. There is no crime
You're
here.
refusing lawful orders.
That's unlawful.
That's unlawful.
You're on my
Pull away.
property.
You're under arrest.
This is unlawful detention.
The opening moments of this encounter do not announce themselves as volatile. There is no immediate urgency in the environment, no flashing signals that something criminal is unfolding. Instead, what the body cam reveals is something far more common and far more dangerous in its subtlety: a loosely defined dispute, emotionally charged but legally fragile, entering the orbit of law enforcement without clear boundaries. This is the terrain where misuse of authority most often takes root, not through overt malice, but through assumption, impatience, and the quiet erosion of constitutional thresholds. At the center of this incident is a conflict that is fundamentally civil in nature, a disagreement over behavior, respect, and perceived harassment unfolds between individuals who already know one another. The setting matters. This is not a traffic stop, not a burglary in progress, not a report of violence in motion. It is a neighborhood interaction, messy and loud, but lacking the foundational elements that typically justify police intrusion beyond peacekeeping. That distinction becomes crucial as the encounter escalates. From the earliest officer engagement, the body cam shows uncertainty masquerading as control. The officer's first actions are not guided by a clear articulation of reasonable suspicion. Instead, they reflect a desire to immediately impose order, requesting identification broadly, without individualized cause, and doing so in a context where compliance is not legally mandatory for everyone present. This is the first pivot point. When officers conflate inconvenience or annoyance with obstruction, the entire trajectory of an encounter can shift. What follows is a rapid tightening of authority without corresponding legal justification. The request for identification is not framed as voluntary. It is delivered with the implicit weight of command. One individual's hesitation, whether rooted in confusion, distrust, or a basic assertion of rights, is treated not as neutral behavior but as defiance. This is a recurring pattern in body cam footage across jurisdictions. Silence or resistance to informal demands becomes recast as criminal interference. The body cam captures the moment when this reframing hardens. The officer's posture changes. Verbal engagement gives way to physical command. Instructions are issued with urgency that exceeds the threat level present. There is no indication of weapons, no visible assault in progress, no credible flight risk. Yet the language used suggests imminent danger, as though escalation itself has become the justification for further escalation. This circular logic is one of the most troubling dynamics in modern policing. When physical compliance is demanded, the threshold has already been crossed. The individual is ordered into a submissive position, not because of articulated probable cause, but because the situation has become out of control in the officer's assessment. Importantly, the body cam does not reveal a clear explanation being given in that moment. There is no grounding of the command in law. The authority asserted is raw, procedural, and opaque. This is where power dynamics become visible. The officer is no longer responding to behavior, they are responding to perceived challenge. The tone shifts from investigatory to disciplinary. The body cam audio reflects impatience layered with threat, warnings of additional charges, implications that continued speech itself may result in arrest. This tactic, while common, sits on shaky constitutional ground. Speech alone, particularly when directed at officers, is not obstruction. Yet the encounter treats it as such. As other individuals attempt to clarify the situation, another pattern emerges: the widening of the enforcement net. Instead of narrowing focus to the original point of concern, the officer's authority expands outward. Bystanders, family members, and vehicle owners are pulled into the frame, not because they are suspected of crimes, but because they are present and vocal. Each additional voice is interpreted as interference rather than context. And the officer repeatedly invokes the concept of obstructing an investigation, but the investigation itself remains undefined. What crime is being investigated? The Bodycam never clearly establishes it. There is reference to someone not wanting to get into a vehicle, but no explanation of why entry into that vehicle was legally required. Without that foundation, the charge of obstruction becomes untethered, an accusation without an anchor. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects a systemic issue in how discretionary authority is exercised. Obstruction statutes are among the most misused tools in policing because they are broad, vague, and easily weaponized against noncompliance. In this encounter, obstruction functions less as a description of conduct and more as a mechanism of control. It is deployed to silence, to compel, and ultimately to justify custody. The Bodycam shows repeated warnings that continued speech will result in arrest. This is a critical moment. The Constitution does not require citizens to remain silent during police encounters, particularly when they are not detained. Yet, the officer's framing suggests that verbal persistence itself is unlawful. This inversion of rights is subtle but profound. It teaches compliance not through law, but through fear of escalation. As the scene unfolds, the officer's attention shifts between individuals, but the underlying posture remains the same. Dominance first, explanation later. The lack of de-escalation is striking. There are multiple opportunities to slow the interaction, to separate parties, to clarify roles, to gather information without threats. None are taken. Instead, the encounter accelerates, driven by frustration and the perceived need to win control of the scene. When an individual is finally detained, the justification offered is thin. The Bodycam does not capture a clear articulation of probable cause prior to restraint. Instead, the detention appears to be retroactively justified through the discovery of outstanding warrants. This is a common but deeply problematic sequence. Warrants found after the fact do not legitimize an unlawful detention that precedes them. Yet in practice, they often obscure the initial misconduct. The presence of warrants shifts the narrative entirely. What began as a questionable detention becomes reframed as a successful enforcement action. The system rewards the outcome, not the process. The officer's earlier missteps fade into the background, overshadowed by the administrative validation that warrants provide. This is how patterns persist. Accountability focuses on results, not rights. Throughout this first phase of the encounter, the Bodycam reveals an absence of procedural clarity. Commands are issued without explanation. Legal thresholds are implied but never stated. The citizen is expected to intuit the law while under stress, while the officer is afforded broad discretion without scrutiny. This imbalance is not accidental, it is structural. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. Authority, once asserted, becomes self-reinforcing. The officer's identity as the controlling force on scene becomes tied to the citizen's submission. Any resistance, even verbal, threatens that identity and must be neutralized. This is not about public safety. It is about maintaining hierarchy. What makes this encounter particularly instructive is how ordinary it appears. There are no dramatic chases, no extreme violence, no sensational visuals. Yet within this mundane setting, constitutional protections erode rapidly. This is how misuse of authority most often manifests, not in rare explosive incidents, but in routine interactions, where oversight is minimal and discretion is wide. As the first part of this documentary closes, the foundation has been laid. A civil dispute has been transformed into a criminal matter. Speech has been treated as obstruction, compliance has been demanded without explanation, and the system stands ready to absorb the outcome without examining the path taken to reach it. The consequences of these choices will continue to unfold, not just for those involved, but for the broader trust between communities and law enforcement. By the time the encounter moves fully into its second phase, the framework has already been set. The officer is no longer seeking clarity. Clarity has been replaced by momentum. This is one of the most dangerous transitions in any police interaction. The moment when an officer stops gathering information and begins managing a narrative. From this point forward, every action is interpreted through the lens of control rather than legality. The body cam shows the officer repeatedly asserting that individuals are interfering or obstructing, yet the underlying behavior remains largely unchanged. People are talking. They are explaining relationships. They are attempting to contextualize what led to the police presence. None of this by itself meets the legal standard for obstruction, but the officer's responses suggest that the threshold has shifted internally. What matters now is not what the law permits, but what the officer will tolerate. This is where escalation psychology becomes visible. Once authority is challenged, even passively, officers often experience what researchers describe as command stress. The need to reassert dominance can override training, policy, and constitutional restraint. The body cam captures this through tone more than action. The language grows sharper. Warnings become more frequent. The implied consequences escalate, even as the situation itself remains static. A critical feature of this phase is the officer's reliance on conditional threats. Phrases implying "if you don't stop talking" or "if you keep this up" function as behavioral levers. They are designed to coerce silence rather than correct unlawful behavior. Importantly, these threats are not accompanied by explanations of what specific law is being violated. This omission is not incidental. It preserves discretion, while placing the burden of compliance entirely on the citizen. The encounter also demonstrates how quickly detention status can become ambiguous. Individuals are told they are not under arrest, yet are instructed where to stand, how to move, and when to remain silent. This gray zone, where a person is functionally detained without being formally detained, is a frequent source of rights violations. The body cam does not show the officer clarifying this boundary. Instead, ambiguity becomes a tool. As more family members and associates become involved, the officer frames their presence as a problem rather than a resource. Rather than separating parties to reduce tension, the officer repeatedly addresses them as a collective obstacle. This approach compounds stress on both sides. Each additional command increases the likelihood of non-compliance, which in turn justifies further escalation in the officer's mind. The officer's repeated invocation of jail as a looming consequence is particularly telling. Jail is presented not as a response to a defined crime, but as a penalty for continued disagreement. This blurs the line between lawful enforcement and punitive intimidation. The Constitution does not permit arrest as a means of winning an argument, yet the body cam shows precisely that dynamic unfolding. Another key moment in this phase is the officer's treatment of ownership and involvement. Questions about vehicles, relationships, and presence are asked not to clarify legal standing, but to assert jurisdiction. The moment an individual acknowledges ownership or connection, they are drawn deeper into the enforcement web. This tactic leverages ordinary cooperation into expanded authority. The body cam audio reflects frustration on both sides, but only one side has the power to convert frustration into custody. This asymmetry is central to understanding how minor disputes escalate into arrests. Citizens may raise their voices, officers raise charges. The consequences are not proportional. As the officer continues to assert obstruction, the justification remains circular. People are interfering because they are speaking. They are speaking because they are being threatened with arrest. This feedback loop is self-sustaining. At no point does the officer pause to reset the interaction or reassess whether continued enforcement is necessary or lawful. What is notably absent in this phase is any attempt at de-escalation. There is no effort to lower voices, to explain rights, or to provide a clear path toward resolution. De-escalation requires patience and a willingness to relinquish some control. The body cam shows neither. Instead, the officer's approach treats compliance as the only acceptable outcome. This is where institutional culture becomes relevant. Officers are often trained, implicitly or explicitly, that control equals safety. Yet this encounter demonstrates the opposite. The more control is demanded, the more resistance emerges. The more resistance emerges, the more control is demanded. The cycle intensifies without producing resolution. The language used toward individuals during this phase also reveals a subtle shift from professional to personal. Remarks about attitude, tone, and behavior suggest that the officer's response is no longer purely procedural. Personal irritation seeps into enforcement decisions. This is a critical failure point. Policing requires emotional regulation, precisely because authority magnifies personal reactions. As the interaction continues, the officer begins to rely on the concept of investigation as a catch-all justification. Yet the body cam still does not establish a clear investigative objective. There is no defined crime, no identified suspect behavior that would independently warrant detention. The investigation exists rhetorically, not substantively. This vagueness is not merely a narrative flaw, it has legal implications. For an obstruction charge to hold, there must be a lawful investigation being impeded. Without a clearly articulated investigation, the charge becomes vulnerable. Yet the system rarely scrutinizes this foundation in real time. Officers are trusted to define the scope after the fact. The second phase also highlights how quickly citizens' attempts to assert rights are reframed as hostility. Requests for clarification are treated as challenges. Disagreement is treated as disrespect. This reframing serves a psychological purpose. It converts constitutional friction into moral justification for force. When the officer ultimately moves toward custody, The Bodycam captures a moment of inevitability, and the outcome feels predetermined, not because of escalating danger, but because the officer's authority has been publicly asserted and cannot be withdrawn without loss of face. This is a dangerous incentive structure. It rewards rigidity over judgment. The discovery of outstanding warrants later in the encounter retroactively legitimizes the arrest in the eyes of the system, but it does not erase the preceding violations. Yet in practice it often does. Courts, departments, and the public frequently collapse the entire encounter into its endpoint, ignoring how that endpoint was reached. This is one of the most corrosive dynamics in accountability cases. The presence of a warrant becomes a narrative shield. It shifts focus away from officer conduct and onto citizen history. The Bodycam, however, preserves the sequence. It shows that the decision to detain preceded the discovery. That order matters. As Part 2 concludes, the encounter stands at a critical juncture. Authority has been asserted repeatedly without clear legal grounding. De-escalation opportunities have been missed. Speech has been criminalized. And the system is poised to validate the outcome regardless of the process. What remains is to examine how these moments are later justified, normalized, and absorbed into institutional memory, and what that means for accountability going forward. By the time the encounter reaches its final stage, the outcome is no longer in question. What remains unresolved is not who will be taken into custody, but how the system will interpret everything that came before. This is where Bodycam footage becomes most revealing, not in what it shows officers doing, but in what it exposes about institutional reflexes, post hoc justification, and the quiet normalization of authority drift. The arrest itself is treated as a procedural conclusion rather than a decision point. The Bodycam reflects a tone shift, urgency fades, voices lower, and the scene becomes administrative. This tonal change is critical. It signals that, in the officer's mind, the encounter has resolved correctly. The fact that earlier actions were legally ambiguous or constitutionally questionable no longer registers as relevant. The system has moved on. This transition illustrates a core problem in modern policing. Outcomes eclipse processes. Once custody is achieved, especially when warrants are discovered, every prior action is implicitly validated. The presence of outstanding warrants acts as a retroactive seal of approval, insulating earlier conduct from scrutiny. The logic becomes circular. The arrest was justified because the person was wanted, and the person was wanted, therefore the arrest was justified, regardless of how it unfolded. But the Bodycam does not lie about sequence. It shows that authority was asserted before warrants were known, that detention preceded confirmation, and that escalation was driven by perceived noncompliance rather than articulable crime. These details matter, yet they are often lost once the incident enters formal review channels. In internal reporting, moments of uncertainty tend to be compressed or omitted. Language becomes sanitized. Subject became uncooperative replaces a complex series of verbal exchanges. Officer feared obstruction substitutes for the absence of a clearly defined investigation. And this is not necessarily intentional dishonesty. It is institutional shorthand. But shorthand has consequences. It erases nuance and shields patterns. The Bodycam captures how quickly the officer's role shifts from enforcer to narrator. Statements made after the fact frame the encounter as inevitable. Resistance is emphasized, context is minimized. The civil nature of the original dispute disappears entirely. What remains is a simplified story of lawful orders and unlawful refusal. This narrative is efficient and dangerously incomplete. Another revealing aspect of this phase is how responsibility is redistributed. The escalation is implicitly blamed on the individuals present. They talked too much. They didn't comply fast enough. They interfered. The officer's choices fade into the background. This framing reinforces a culture where citizens are responsible for managing police emotions, rather than officers being responsible for managing their authority. The psychological burden of this expectation is significant. Citizens are required to anticipate not only lawful commands, but an officer's tolerance level. Silence becomes safer than speech. Submission becomes safer than clarification. Over time, this dynamic reshapes public behavior, not through law, but through learned avoidance. That is not constitutional policing, it is behavioral conditioning. As the encounter winds down, the body cam reveals something else that often goes unnoticed: the absence of reflection. There is no moment where the officer questions whether escalation was necessary, no acknowledgement that the situation might have been handled differently. This absence is not an individual failing, it is institutional. Reflection is rarely rewarded in policing. Resolution is. The broader system reinforces this mindset. Prosecutors focus on charges, not conduct. Departments focus on policy compliance, not constitutional nuance. Courts often defer to officer testimony unless egregious misconduct is evident. In this ecosystem, the kind of authority drift seen here is not only tolerated, it is normalized. This normalization has long-term consequences. Each unchallenged encounter becomes precedent in practice, if not in law. Officers internalize what works. Obstruction charges become tools for managing dissent. Detention becomes a method of control rather than a response to crime. Over time, the line between lawful enforcement and authoritarian impulse blurs. The body cam also highlights how accountability mechanisms lag behind reality. Even when footage exists, its interpretation is filtered through institutional priorities. Unless a case attracts public attention or legal challenge, these encounters rarely result in corrective action. The individuals involved bear the consequences. The system absorbs the lesson that escalation is acceptable. This is where the final irony emerges. Body cameras were introduced as accountability tools, yet they often function as evidence repositories without evaluative teeth. They show what happened, but they do not compel change. Without a culture willing to interrogate authority, footage becomes archival rather than transformative. The closing moments of the encounter are quiet. The chaos has passed. The power imbalance has been resolved in favor of the state. But the underlying issues remain unresolved. The civil dispute that triggered the interaction is untouched. The rights confusion that fueled escalation is unaddressed. The officer leaves the scene reinforced in their authority, not informed by its limits. This is how patterns persist, not through dramatic failures, but through routine acceptance. Each encounter like this becomes another data point in a system that prioritizes control over clarity. And each time, the distance between constitutional ideals and street-level practice grows slightly wider. What the body cam ultimately documents is not just an arrest, but a process of erosion. Rights erode when they are treated as inconveniences. Trust erodes when authority is exercised without explanation. Accountability erodes when outcomes overshadow methods. None of this requires bad actors. It requires only a system that confuses compliance with legitimacy. As the documentary closes, the lesson is not about individual guilt or innocence. It is about structure, about how discretionary power, when unchecked, reshapes everyday encounters into mechanisms of control, about how ordinary moments become sites of constitutional significance, and about how easily those moments pass without consequence. The camera turns off. The paperwork begins. The system moves forward unchanged. But the footage remains, a quiet record of how authority was asserted, and how escalation was chosen, and how accountability was deferred. In that record lies the real story, one that repeats, not because it is hidden, but because it has been allowed to become normal.